What about you, Charlene? I asked. What is your group doing? We're journalists, researchers, she replied, working to help people appreciate and learn from each other. What journalism is really all about is looking deeply at the life and beliefs of the people and organizations we cover, at their true substance, the higher expression and form, such as we're seeing in each other now, their positive message and contribution to the world. I again remembered my conversation with Joel, specifically his jaded cynicism. It's hard to see journalists doing that, I said. We're not, she replied. Not yet. But this is the ideal toward which the profession is evolving. This is our true destiny, once we become more secure and break free from the old worldview in which we need to win and bring energy and status our way. It makes perfect sense why I wanted to be born into my family. They were all so inquisitive. I picked up on their excitement, their need for information. That's why I was a reporter for so long, and then with a research firm. I wanted to help work out the ethics of reporting, and then come together with all of... She paused and drifted away again, staring at the floor of the cave. Then her eyes widened, and she said, I know how we're bringing in the world vision. As we remember our birth visions and integrate them together as a group, we merge the power of our relative groups in the other dimension. That helps us remember even more, so we finally get to the overall vision of the world. We all stared at her, puzzled. Look at the whole picture, she explained. Each person on Earth belongs to a soul group, and these soul groups represent the various occupational groups that exist on the planet. Medical people, lawyers, accountants, computer workers, farmers, every field of human endeavor. Once people find their right work, the job that really fits them, then they are working with other members of their soul group. As each of us wakes up and begins to remember our birth visions, the occupational groups to which we belong come more into enlightenment with the members of our group in the other dimension. And each occupational group on Earth moves toward its true soul purpose, its role of service in human society. We all continue to be spellbound. It's like with us journalists, she continued. Throughout history, we have been the individuals most inquisitive about what others in the culture are doing. And then, a few centuries ago, we became conscious enough of ourselves to form a defined occupation. Since then, we've been busy broadening our use of the media and reaching more and more people with our newscasts, that sort of thing. But, like everyone else, we suffered from insecurity. We felt that to get attention and energy from the rest of humanity, we had to create increasingly more sensational stories, thinking that only negativity and violence sells. But that's not our true role. Our spiritual role is to deepen and spiritualize our perception of other people. We see and then communicate what the various soul groups and individuals within these groups are doing, and what they stand for, making it easier for everyone to learn the truth others provide. It's the same for every occupational group. We're all awakening to our true message and purpose. And as this happens all over the planet, we're then able to go further. We can form close spiritual associations with people outside our particular soul group, just the way we're doing here, now. See what just happened? We all shared the message we came here to offer, the message that was foreshown in our birth visions. And that transforms not only human society, but the culture in the afterlife as well. First, each of our soul groups comes closer into vibration with us on Earth, and we with them, the two dimensions opening into each other. Because of this closure, we can begin to have communication between the dimensions. We are able to see souls in the afterlife and pick up on their knowledge and memory more readily. That's happening with increasing frequency on the Earth. As Charlene was speaking, I noticed the soul groups behind each of us widening and spreading out until each touched the others, forming a continuous circle around us. The convergence seemed to jolt me into an even higher awareness. Charlene seemed to feel it too. She took a breath and then with emphasis continued. The other thing that happens in the afterlife is that the groups themselves come closer into resonance with each other. That's why the Earth is the primary focus of the souls in heaven. They can't unite on their own. Over there, soul groups remain fragmented and out of resonance with each other because they live in an imaginary world of ideas that manifest instantly and disappear just as quickly. So, reality is always arbitrary. There is no natural world, no atomic structure as we have here that serves as a stable platform, a background stage, that is common to all of us. We affect what happens on this stage, but ideas manifest much more slowly, and we must reach some agreement on what we want to happen in the future. It's this agreement, this consensus, this unity of vision on the earth that also pulls the soul groups together in the afterlife dimension. That's why the earth dimension is deemed so important. The physical arena is the theater upon which evolution has been playing out for both dimensions. And now we're bringing it all into culmination as we remember consciously what's going on. She pointed to each of us with a sweeping motion of her finger. This is the awareness that we're remembering together, right now. And it's the awareness that other groups, just like us, are remembering all over the planet. We all have a piece of the complete vision. And when we share what we know and unify our soul groups, then we're ready to bring the whole picture into consciousness. Suddenly, Charlene was interrupted by a slight tremor that ran through the earth under the cave. Specks of dust fell from the ceiling. Simultaneously, we heard the hum again, but this time the dissonance had disappeared. It sounded almost harmonious.
"Oh, God," Curtis said. "They almost have the calibrations right. We have to go back to the bunker."
He made a movement to get up, as the energy level of the group plummeted.
"Wait," I said. "What are we going to do there?"
We agreed that we would wait here until dark. There's still hours of daylight out there.
I say we stay here.
We achieved a high level of energy, but we haven't moved through the rest of the process yet. We seem to have cleared our residual emotions and amplified our energy and shared our birth visions, but we haven't seen the intention behind history yet. I think we can do more if we remain where it's safe and try to go farther.
"It's too late for that," Curtis said. "They're ready to complete the experiment. If anything can be done, we've got to go there and do it now."
I looked hard at him. "You said they were probably going to kill Charlene. If we're caught, they'll do the same to us."
Maya held her head in her hands, and Curtis looked away, trying to shake off the panic. "Well, I'm going," Curtis finally said. Charlene leaned forward.
"I think we should stay together."
For an instant I saw her in Native American clothing, again in the virgin woods of the 19th century. The image quickly faded. Maya stood up. "Charlene is right," she said. "We have to stay together, and it might help if we can see what they're doing." I looked out through the cave's entrance, a long, deep-seated reluctance rising in my gut. "What are we going to do with this operative outside?" "We'll drag him into the cave and leave him here," Curtis said. "We can send someone for him in the morning, if we can." I met eyes with Charlene, then nodded in agreement. We knelt at the top of the hill and looked carefully down at the base of a larger ridge. I could see nothing out of the ordinary in the fading light, no movement, no guards. The hum, which had persisted for most of the 40-minute walk, had now completely disappeared. "Are you sure we're at the right place?" I asked Curtis. "Yes," he said. "You see the 4 large boulders about 50 feet up the slope? The doorway is right beneath them, hidden in the bushes. To the right, you can just make out the top of the projection dish. It looks functional again." "I see it," Maya said. We waited for signs of activity, hesitant to move or talk much until darkness had fallen across the valley. Suddenly, we heard a movement behind us. Flashlights clicked on, flooding us in light, and 4 armed men rushed in, demanding that we raise our hands and surrender. After spending 10 minutes going through our gear, they thoroughly searched each of us, then moved the group down the hill and up to the bunker's entrance. The door of the bunker swung open, and Feynman charged out. "Are these the ones we've been looking for?" he shouted. "Where did you find them?" One of the guards explained what had happened, as Feynman shook his head. What are you doing here?" "You've got to stop what you're doing," Curtis retorted. "Curtis Farrell, I'll be damned," Feynman said. "You blew up our dish, didn't you?" "Listen to me," Curtis said. "You know this generator's too dangerous to operate at these levels. You could ruin this entire valley." "You were always an alarmist, Farrell. That's why we let you go at Del Tech. I've been working on this project for too long to give up at this point. It's going to work, exactly as I planned." Curtis edged toward him. "You want to centralize the generating process so you can control it. That's not right." Feynman stared angrily at Curtis. "You're so naive. Do you think the interests that act to control energy prices now would allow a sudden massive shift to an inexpensive source? Of course not. It has to be centralized and packaged to work at all. And I'm going to be known for having done this. It's what I was born to do." "That's not true," I blurted. "You were born to do something else, to help us." Feynman swung around to face me. "Shut up! Do you hear me? All of you!" He looked us over, then shook his head and walked over to one of the armed men. "Keep them here until this is over. All we need is another hour. If they try to escape, shoot them." The operative spoke briefly to the other three, and they formed a perimeter, encircling us at a distance of about 30 feet. "Sit down," one of them said in a foreign accent. We sat facing each other in the darkness, our energy almost totally deflated. There had been no signs of the soul groups since we left the cave. "What do you think we should do?" I asked Charlene. "Nothing's changed," she whispered. "We've got to build our energy again." The darkness was almost total, broken only by the operative's lights sweeping back and forth across the group. I could barely make out the outlines of the others' faces, even though we were sitting in a tight circle 8 feet apart.
"We have to try to escape," Curtis whispered. "I think they will kill us."
Suddenly I remembered the image I'd seen in Feynman's birth vision. He envisioned being with us in the woods, in the dark. I knew there was also another landmark in the scene, but I couldn't remember what it was. "No," I said. "I think we need to try again, here." At that moment, the air was filled with a high-pitched sound, a sound similar to the hum, but again, more in harmony, almost pleasing to the ear. Again a perceptible shimmer swept through the ground under our bodies.
"We have to increase our energy now,"
Maya whispered. "I don't know if I can do it here," Curtis responded.
"You have to,"
I said.
"Focus on each other the way we did before,"
Maya added. I tried to screen out the ominous scene around us and return to an inner state of love. Ignoring the shadows and the flickering beams of light, I focused on the beauty of the faces in the circle. As I struggled to locate the others' higher self-expression, I began to notice a shift in the light pattern around us. Gradually, I could see every face and expression very clearly, as though I was looking through an infrared viewer.
"What do we visualize?"
Curtis asked in desperation. "We have to get back to our birth visions," Maya said. "Remember why we came." Suddenly, the ground shook violently, and the sound from the experiment again took on a dissonant, grating quality. "We've got to visualize stopping them," Curtis said. We moved closer together, and our collective thought seemed to project the image of fighting back. We knew that somehow we could marshal our forces and push back the negative and destructive attempts of the experiment. I even picked up a picture of Feynman being pushed backwards, his equipment blowing up and burning, his men fleeing in terror. Another surge in the noise disrupted my focus. The experiment was continuing. 50 feet away, a huge pine tree snapped in half and thundered to the ground. With a ripping sound and a cloud of dust, a fissure, 5 feet wide, opened up between us and the guard on the right. He reeled back in horror, the beam of his flashlight swinging wild in the night. "This isn't working!" Maya screamed. Another tree crashed to the earth on our left, as the earth slid 4 or 5 feet, knocking us flat to the ground. Maya looked horrified and jumped to her feet. "I've got to get away from here!" she yelled, then began to run north into the darkness. The guard on that side, lying flat where he had been thrown by the earth's movement, rolled to his knees and caught her form in the beam of his flashlight, then raised his gun.
No!
Wait!
I screamed. As she ran, Maya looked back, spotting the guard who was now aiming directly at her, preparing to fire at point-blank range. The scene seemed to shift into slow motion, and as the gun discharged, every line in her face revealed an awareness that she was about to die. But instead of the bullets ripping into her side and back, a wisp of white light darted in front of her, and the bullets bore no effect. She hesitated momentarily, then disappeared into the darkness. At the same time, sensing the opportunity, Charlene leaped up from her position to my right and ran to the northeast into the dust, her movement totally unnoticed by the guards. I started to run, but the guard who had fired at Maya turned his weapon toward me. Quickly, Curtis reached out and grabbed my legs, dragging me to the ground. Gradually, the noise began to diminish, and the earth's movement slowed to mere tremors. "For God's sake!" Curtis yelled toward him. "You've got to stop this now!" Feynman's face was covered with dust. "There's nothing wrong that we can't fix," he said, with eerie calm. The guards were on their feet, dusting themselves off and walking toward us. Feynman noticed that Maya and Charlene were missing, but before he could say anything, the noise returned with ear-shattering volume, and the earth under us seemed to leap upward several feet, rolling everyone to the ground once more. The splintering limbs from a falling tree sent the guards scurrying toward the bunker.
"Now," Curtis said. "Let's go!"
We ran northeast in the same direction that Maya had fled. Several more tremors reverberated under our feet, and then the movements and sounds ceased. After making our way through the dark woods for several miles, our path lighted only by the rays of the moon filtering through the foliage, we stopped and huddled in a grove of small pines. A clear picture of the falls entered my mind. It was still pristine, undisturbed. "We have to go northwest, to the falls," I said. Curtis nodded toward the north, and as silently as possible we headed in that direction, crossing the stream and carefully making our way toward the canyon. After another mile, we began to see the moonlit canyon walls rising up into the distance. As we approached the rocky mouth, Curtis led the way across the creek. Suddenly, he jumped backward in fright as another person walked around a tree from the left. The person screamed and recoiled, almost losing balance, teetering at the edge of a creek bank. Curtis recovered and lunged forward and pulled her back as rocks and gravel slid into the water. Leaning back against a larger tree, Maya took a deep breath, then asked, "What happened when that guard fired back there? How did those bullets miss me? I saw this strange streak of light." "I don't know," I said. We looked at each other. No one spoke. Then in the silence, I heard the distinct sound of someone walking up ahead. "Wait," I said to the others. "Someone's up there." We crouched down and waited. 10 minutes went by. Suddenly, from the trees ahead, Charlene walked up and dropped to her knees. "Thank God I found you," she said. Maya motioned for us, and we all moved out to a clearing where the creek went through the mouth of the canyon. Here the full light of the moon illuminated the grass and the rocks to each side. "Maybe we're going to have another chance," she said, urging us with her hands to sit down and face each other. "What are we going to do?" Curtis said. "We can't stay here long. They'll be coming." I looked at Maya, thinking we should go on to the falls, but she seemed so energized that instead I asked, "What do you think went wrong before?" "I don't know. Maybe there were too few of us. You said there were supposed to be 7. Or perhaps there's too much fear." Charlene leaned toward the group. "I think we have to remember the energy we achieved when we were in the cave. We have to connect at that level again. We have to give each other energy. Find the higher self expression." I took several deep breaths and watched the faces of the others again. Gradually they became more beautiful and luminescent, and I caught sight of their authentic soul expression. Around us, the surrounding plants and rocks lit up even more, as though the moon's rays had suddenly doubled. A familiar wave of love and euphoria swept through my body, and I turned to see the shimmering figures of my soul group behind me. "Look at that," Charlene suddenly said, pointing at the soul groups all around us. Each soul group was beginning to blend with the others, just as they had done at the cave. I glanced at Charlene and then at Curtis and Maya. I could now see on their faces an even fuller expression of who they were as participants in the long movement of human civilization. "This is it," I said. "We're reaching the next step. We're seeing a more complete vision of human history." Suddenly, before us, in a huge hologram, appeared an image of history that seemed to stretch out from the very beginning to what appeared to be a distant end. As I strained to focus, I realized that this was an image very similar to the one I had observed earlier, while with my soul group, except that in this instance the story was beginning much earlier, with the birth of the universe itself. Suddenly we found ourselves watching as the first matter exploded into being and gravitated into stars that lived and died and spewed forth the great diversity of elements that ultimately formed the Earth. These elements, in turn, combined in the early terrestrial environment into ever more complex substances until they finally leaped into organic life. Life which then also moved forward into greater organization and awareness, as if guided by an overall plan. A clear picture of the afterlife dimension opened up in front of us, and I understood instantly that an aspect of each of the souls there, in fact, a part of all humanity, had lived through this long, slow process of evolution. We had swam as fishes, boldly crawled upon the land as amphibians, and struggled to survive as reptiles, birds, and mammals, fighting every step of the way to finally move into human form, all with intention. We knew that through wave after wave of successive generations, we would be born into the physical plane, and no matter how long it took, we would strive to wake up and unify and evolve, and eventually implement on Earth the same spiritual culture that exists in the afterlife. Certainly the journey would be difficult, even torturous. With the first intuition to awaken, we would sense the fear of aloneness and separateness. Yet we would not go back to sleep. We would fight through the fear, relying on the dim intuition that we weren't alone, that we were spiritual beings with a spiritual purpose on the planet. And, following the urge of evolution, we would gravitate together into larger, more complex social groupings, differentiating into more diverse occupations, overcoming a need to defeat and conquer each other, and eventually implementing a democratic process through which new ideas could be shared and synthesized and evolved into even better truths. Gradually, our security would come from inside us. As we progressed, from an expression of the divine in terms of nature gods, to the divine as one Father God outside ourselves, to a final expression as the Holy Spirit within. Over time, we knew our urge to unify and share would expand until we sensed a special community, a deeper association with others who shared a particular geographical location on the planet, and the human world would begin to solidify into political nation-states, each holding a unique viewpoint. Soon after would come an explosion of trade and commerce. The scientific method would be instituted, and the resulting discoveries would initiate a period of economic preoccupation and the great secular expansion known as the Industrial Revolution. And once we developed a web of economic relationships around the globe, we would begin to further awaken and to remember our full spiritual nature. The insights would gradually permeate human consciousness, and we would evolve our economy into a form compatible with the Earth, and finally begin to move beyond the last fearful polarization of forces toward a new spiritual worldview on the planet. Suddenly, the hologram focused on the polarization in great detail. All humans on the Earth were quickly migrating into two conflicting positions, one pushing toward a vague but ever clearer image of transformation, and the other resisting, sensing that important values contained in the old view were being lost forever. We could see that in the afterlife dimension, it was known that this conflict would be our greatest challenge to the spiritualization of the physical dimension, particularly if the polarization grew extreme. In this case, both sides would entrench into an irrational projection of evil onto the other. Or worse, might believe the literal interpreters of the end times prophecies and began to think the future was beyond their influence, and therefore give up completely. To find the world vision and resolve the polarization, we could see that our afterlife intention was to discern the deeper truths of these prophecies. As with all the scriptures, the visions in Daniel and Revelations were divine intuitions coming from the afterlife into the physical plane, and so must be understood as draped in the symbolism of the seer's mind, much like a dream. The prophecies envisioned an eventual end to the human story on earth, but an end that, for believers, would be quite different from the one experienced by non-believers. Those in the latter group were seen to experience an end of history that would begin with great catastrophes and environmental disasters, collapsing economies. Then, at the height of the fear and chaos, a strong leader would emerge, the Antichrist, who would offer to restore order, but only if individuals would agree to give up their liberties and carry the mark of the beast upon their bodies in order to participate in the automated economy. Eventually, this strong leader would declare himself a god and take by force any country that resisted his rule, at first making war on the forces of Islam, then on the Jews and Christians, ultimately casting the whole world into a fiery Armageddon. For believers, on the other hand, the scriptural prophets predicted a much more pleasant end to history. Remaining true to the Spirit, these believers would be given spiritual bodies and be raptured into another dimension called the New Jerusalem, but would be able to go back and forth into the physical. Eventually, at a certain point in the war, God would fully return to end the fighting, restore the earth, and implement 1,000 years of peace, where there would be no sickness or death, and everything would be transformed, even the animals of the world, who would no longer eat meat. Instead, the lion would lay down with the lamb. Maya and Curtis caught my eye, and then Charlene looked up. We all seemed to sense at once the core meaning of the prophecies. What the end-time seers were receiving was an intuition that in our time, two distinctive futures would be opening before us. We could choose either to languish in the fear, believing that the world is moving into a Big Brother-style automation and social decay and ultimate destruction, or we could follow the other path and consider ourselves the believers who can overcome this nihilism and open to the higher vibrations of love, where we are spared the apocalypse and can enter a new dimension in which we invite the Spirit, through us, to create just the utopia the scriptural prophets envisioned. Now we could see why those in the afterlife felt that our interpretation of these prophecies was key to resolving the polarization. If we decide that these scriptures mean that the destruction of the world is inevitable, written unalterably into God's plan, the effect of such a belief would be to create this very outcome. Suddenly, the hologram raced forward, and I felt another expansion of consciousness. I knew that we were now moving into the next step of the process, the actual remembrance of how we intended to become believers and accomplish this prophesied utopian future. We were finally remembering the world vision. As we watched, we first saw 10th Insight groups forming all over the planet, pulling in the world vision, reaching critical mass, and then learning to project this vision in such a way that the entrenched sides of the polarization immediately began to lighten and ease, letting go of the fear. Especially affected would be the technological controllers, who would remember themselves and give up their last efforts to manipulate the economy and seize power. The result of the projected vision would be an unprecedented wave of awakening and remembrance and cooperation and personal involvement, and a virtual explosion of newly inspired individuals, each of whom would begin to fully recall their birth visions and follow their synchronistic path into exactly the right occupational position within their culture. The scene shifted to images of decaying inner cities and forgotten rural families. Here we could see a new consensus forming on how to intervene in the cycle of poverty. No longer would intervention be conceived in terms of government programs or merely in terms of education and jobs. The new approach would be deeply spiritual, for the structures of education were already in place. What was missing was the ability to break free from the fear and to overcome the hellish diversions set up to ward off the anxiety of poverty. As this contagion continued, incidents of violent crime began to mysteriously decrease across human culture. For, as we saw clearly, the roots of violence are always frustration and passion and fear that dehumanize the victim, and a growing interaction with those carrying a higher awareness was now beginning to disrupt this mindset. Simultaneously, as increasingly more people awakened, I saw millions of individuals taking time to intervene in conflict at every level of human culture. For we all were reaching a new understanding of what was at stake. In every situation where a husband or wife grew angry and lashed out at the other, or where addictive compulsions or a desperate need for approval led a youthful gang member to kill, or where a person felt so restricted in their lives that they embezzled or defrauded or manipulated someone for gain, in all these situations there was someone perfectly placed to have prevented the violence, but who had failed to act. Now the 10th insight was emerging, and we knew that the people in our lives were probably souls with whom we had had long relationships over many lifetimes, and who were now counting on our help. So we are compelled to act, compelled to be courageous. None of us wants to have failure on our conscience, or to have to bear a torturous life review, in which we must watch the tragic consequences of our timidity. As the scenes rushed past, we saw this burgeoning awareness motivating activity toward other social problems as well. I could see an image of the world's rivers and oceans, and again I observed a new synthesis of the old and new, which, while admitting the often capricious behavior of government bureaucracy, also raised to a new level of priority the human desire to safeguard the environment, initiating a surge of private intervention. Similarly, we observed the environmental practices of governments themselves being exposed, especially regarding policies toward public lands. For years, it would be discovered, governmental agencies had sold mining and logging rights on some of the most sacred places on Earth at below market rates as political favors and paybacks. Majestic cathedral forests belonging to the public had been unbelievably pillaged and clear-cut in the name of proper forest management, as though planting rows of pine trees would replace the diversity of life and energies inherent in a hardwood forest that had matured for centuries. Yet it would be the emerging spiritual awareness that would finally force an end to such disgrace. We watched a new coalition forming, made up of old view hunters and nostalgic history buffs, and those who perceive the natural sites as sacred portals. This coalition would finally sound the alarm that would save the few remaining virgin forests in Europe and North America, and begin to protect on a larger scale the essential rainforests in the tropical regions of the world. It would be commonly understood that every remaining site of beauty must be saved for the benefit of the future. As we continued to watch, the scenes accelerated forward, and we could see individuals remembering their spiritual missions at increasingly younger ages. Here we could see the precise understanding that would soon embody the new spiritual worldview. Individuals would come of age and remember themselves as souls born from one dimension of existence into another. Although memory loss during the transition would be expected, recapturing pre-life memory would become an important early goal of education. As youths, our teachers would first guide us through the early experience of synchronicity, urge us to identify our intuitions to study certain subjects, to visit particular places, always looking for higher answers as to why we were pursuing these particular paths. As the full memory of the insights emerged, we would find ourselves involved with certain groups, working on particular projects, bringing in our full vision of what we had wanted to do. And finally, we would recover the underlying intention behind our lives. We would know that we came here to raise the vibratory level of this planet, to discover and protect the beauty and energy of its natural sites, and to ensure that all humans had access to these special locations so that we could continue to increase our energy, ultimately instituting the afterlife culture here in the physical. Such a world view would especially shift the way we looked at other people. No longer would we see human beings merely in the racial dress or national origin of one particular lifetime. Instead, we would see others as brother or sister souls, engaged, like us, in a process of coming awake and of spiritualizing the planet. It would become known that the settling of certain souls into various geographical locations on the planet had occurred with great meaning. Each nation was, in fact, an enclave of specific spiritual information, shared and modeled by its citizens, information waiting to be learned and integrated. As I watched the future unfold, I could see that a world political unity, envisioned by so many, was finally being achieved, not by forcing all nations into subservience to one political body, but rather through a grassroots acknowledgement of our spiritual similarities, while treasuring our local autonomy and cultural differences. As with individuals interacting in a group, each member of the family of nations was being recognized for the cultural truth they represented to the world at large. Before us, we saw Earth's political struggles, so often violent, shifting into a war of words. As the tide of remembrance continued to sweep the planet, all humans began to understand that our destiny was to discuss and compare the perspective of our relative religions, and, while honoring the best of their individual doctrines at the personal level, to ultimately see that each religion supplemented the others, and to integrate them into a synthesized global spirituality. We could see clearly that these dialogues would result in the rebuilding of a grand temple in Jerusalem, jointly occupied by all the major religions, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Eastern, even the de facto religion of secular idealism, represented by those economic enclaves in China and Europe who thought primarily in terms of a pantheistic economic utopia. Here, ultimate spiritual perspective would be debated and discussed. And in this war of words and energy, at first the Islamic and the Jewish perspectives would hold center stage. Then the Christian perspective would be compared and integrated, along with the inner vision of the Eastern religions. We saw the awareness of humanity entering another level, with the collective human culture progressing from primarily the sharing of economic information to the synchronistic exchange of spiritual truths. As this occurred, certain individuals and groups would begin to reach levels approaching that of the afterlife dimension, and would disappear to the larger majority remaining on Earth. These select groups would walk intentionally into the other dimension, yet would learn to go back and forth, just as the ninth insight predicts, and the scriptural prophets saw. Yet after this rapture began, those left on Earth would understand what was occurring, and accept their role in remaining in the physical, knowing that they would soon follow. Now it was time for the secular idealists to proclaim their truths on the temple steps. At first, their energetic thrust into Jerusalem would come from Europe, with its primarily secular vision, with one strong leader proclaiming the spiritual importance of secular matters. This perspective would be met strongly by the determined otherworldly spiritualism of the Muslims and the Christians. But then this conflict of energy would be mediated and later synthesized into one by the inner spiritual emphasis of the Eastern perspective. By then, the last attempts of the controllers, who had once conspired to create a tyrannical society of chips and robots and forced compliance, would have been won over by the contagion of awakening. And this last synthesis would open everyone to the final infusion of the Holy Spirit. We saw clearly that through this Middle Eastern dialogue of energy integration, history had fulfilled the scriptural prophecies in a symbolic and verbal manner, avoiding the physical apocalypse expected by the literalists. Suddenly, our focus shifted to the afterlife dimension. And here we could see with great clarity that our intention all along was not merely to create a new earth, but a new heaven as well.
We watched as the effect of the world vision remembrance not only transformed the physical dimension, but the afterlife as well. During the raptures on Earth, the soul groups would also have been rapturing toward the physical dimension, completing the transfer of energy into the expanded physical dimension. Here, the stark reality of what was happening in the historical process became apparent. From the beginning of time, as our memory opened, energy and knowledge had systematically moved from the afterlife dimension into the physical. At first, the soul groups in the afterlife had borne full responsibility for maintaining the intention and envisioning the future, helping us to recall what we wanted to do, giving us energy. Then, as consciousness on Earth progressed and the population increased, the balance of energy and responsibility had slowly shifted toward the physical dimension, until, at this point in history, when enough energy had shifted and the world vision was being remembered, and more souls than ever before were living on the planet, the power and responsibility for believing and creating the intended future would be shifting from the afterlife to the souls on Earth, to the newly forming groups, to us. At this point, we would have to carry the intent. And that's why it fell to us to resolve the polarization, and to help shift the particular individuals right here in this valley who were still caught in the fear, and who felt justified in manipulating the economy for their own purposes, justified in seizing control of the future. At exactly the same time, all four of us glanced at each other in the darkness. The hologram still surrounding us, the soul groups still merged in the background, glowing brightly. Abruptly, a silent vibration tingled my solar plexus. The experiment had been reactivated. "Look over there!" Curtis suddenly yelled. 50 yards away, barely distinguishable in the moonlight, was a narrow fissure, shaking the bushes and small trees, extending slowly in our direction. I looked at the others. "It's up to us now," Maya shouted. "We have enough of the vision now. We can stop them." Before we could act, the earth under us shook violently, and the fissure accelerated toward us. Simultaneously, several vehicles pulled to a stop in the underbrush, their lights shining through fuzzy silhouettes made by the trees and dust. Unafraid, I maintained my energy and focused again on the hologram. "The vision will stop them!" Maya yelled again. "Don't let the vision go! Hold it!" Embracing the image of the future before us, I again felt the group marshal energy toward Feynman, as if holding our intention like a giant wall against his intrusion, imaging his group being pushed back by the energy, fleeing in terror. I glanced at the crevice, still racing toward us, confident it would soon stop. It accelerated instead. Another tree fell, then another. As it sped into the group, I lost my concentration and rolled backward, choking on the dust. "It's still not working!" I heard Curtis yell. I felt like it was all happening again. "Up this way!" I shouted, struggling to see in the sudden darkness. As I ran, I could barely make out the dim outlines of the others. They were veering away from me, to the east.